The quaint New England town of Oakhaven always seemed to exist in a perpetual state of amber-hued nostalgia, its cobbled streets whispering tales of centuries past. At its very heart stood the venerable Vance Historical Society, a grand old edifice of dark wood and stained glass, a silent testament to the enduring legacy of one family. And at the very heart of that institution, a quiet, meticulous anchor to its storied past, was Eleanor Vance. At 50 years old, Eleanor exuded a serene, almost ageless grace. Her silvering hair, always impeccably coiled into a neat bun, framed intelligent eyes that, behind slender spectacles, held a cautious glint. She was not a woman given to grand gestures or boisterous laughter. Instead, her world was one of hushed archives, brittle parchment, and the gentle rustle of turning pages. Each morning, she would walk the short distance from her ancestral home, a dignified, albeit somewhat draughty Victorian house filled with the ghosts of generations, to the society. The scent of old paper and polished wood was her perfume, the quiet hum of history her symphony. Eleanor's deepest aspiration wasn't wealth or worldly fame, but something far more profound to her: the preservation of her family's esteemed reputation and the unwavering prosperity of the very historical society her ancestors had founded. She truly believed that within those carefully catalogued documents and ancient artifacts lay not just facts, but profound truths. Her days were a methodical dance of cataloguing, researching, and occasionally giving tours to respectful, often elderly visitors. She found immense, quiet joy in connecting with the past, in meticulously arranging its fragments, convinced that in doing so, she was safeguarding not just a collection, but an entire way of life, an untarnished lineage. Her life in Oakhaven was one of undisputed respect. The townspeople, from old Mr. Henderson, who ran the general store, to young Mrs. Davies, who taught at the elementary school, treated the Vance name with a quiet reverence. Eleanor was the embodiment of tradition, a living link to the very fabric of Oakhaven. There was a subtle pride in her posture, a silent contentment in her carefully cultivated routine. She moved through her days with purpose, believing that her life was a carefully constructed testament to honor and duty. Beneath this polished surface, however, lays a deep-seated fear of scandal, an almost visceral aversion to anything that might tarnish the Vance name she so diligently protected. This silent anxiety was a constant, though rarely acknowledged, companion. She was fiercely loyal, or so she told herself, to the idea of her family and its legacy. This loyalty, however, often blurred with a silent, insidious pride, a conviction that the Vance name must remain unsullied, untainted by the imperfections of human frailty. This quiet adherence to reputation, rather than raw emotional honesty, was her Achilles' heel, a flaw that had years ago led to a critical error, a long-buried secret that she believed was safely interred in the annals of history, much like the documents she so carefully preserved. Her existence was one of carefully maintained appearances, a beautiful, fragile glass dome, shielding her from the messy truths of life. Her solitary life, while outwardly serene, also held a subtle undercurrent of unresolved tension, particularly concerning her sister. Clara, her younger sister, had vanished from Oakhaven decades ago under circumstances the family rarely spoke of, and even more rarely returned. Their relationship was a strained silence, a chasm that had grown wider with each passing year. Yet even this unresolved void was carefully compartmentalized in Eleanor's mind, a distant ache rather than an open wound. The cherished past of the Vance family remained, in her carefully curated narrative, untouched by public scrutiny, a perfect, unblemished tapestry. Eleanor truly believed she had achieved a state of quiet, dignified happiness. Her days were a gentle rhythm of purpose and pride. She was respected, her routines comforting, and her legacy, she thought, secure. She often found herself smiling softly as she looked out over the town from the society's grand bay window, believing herself to be a woman who had navigated life's currents with unwavering integrity. Little did she know, the calm surface of her meticulously ordered world was about to shatter, disturbed by echoes from a past she had desperately tried to silence. Before we delve deeper into Eleanor's story, if you find yourself connecting with her journey, please consider taking a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more untold stories of resilience and redemption to light. The crisp autumn air of Oakhaven usually brought with it a sense of cozy anticipation, the scent of wood smoke mingling with fading leaves. But for Eleanor, that particular autumn would forever be seared into her memory as the season her world crumbled. It began not with a bang, but with a hushed phone call, a somber voice delivering news that, while expected due to her advanced age, still landed with the force of a physical blow. Aunt Beatrice had passed away. Aunt Beatrice, a formidable, silver-haired matriarch of the Vance family, had been a pillar of the Historical Society, her presence as ingrained in its halls as the dust motes dancing in sunbeams. Her passing was, of course, a sorrowful event, but Eleanor, ever the pragmatist, had already begun to mentally prepare for the transition of power within the society. What she hadn't prepared for was the reading of the will. The lawyer's office, usually a bastion of quiet decorum, felt charged with an unsettling electricity. Eleanor sat stiffly, her perfectly composed exterior betraying nothing of the quiet anxiety that coiled in her stomach. Around her sat distant cousins, representatives from various Oakhaven charities, and, conspicuously absent, Clara. The air was thick with polite condolences and the rustle of legal papers. The initial clauses of the will were straightforward: bequests to various relatives, donations to local institutions. Eleanor felt a subtle loosening of the knot in her chest. All was in order, the Vance legacy secure. Then the lawyer cleared his throat, a sound that seemed to echo ominously in the suddenly silent room. "And finally," he began, "a codicil appended to the will just 6 months prior to Miss Beatrice Vance's passing." Eleanor frowned slightly. The codicil? This was unexpected. As the lawyer continued to read, each word landed like a hammer blow, shattering the fragile peace Eleanor had so carefully constructed. The codicil's demand was shockingly simple, yet utterly devastating. Eleanor Vance was required to locate and reconcile with her estranged sister, Clara. If this reconciliation, deemed genuine and heartfelt by an independent arbiter, did not occur within 1 year, the entire Vance family estate and the substantial endowment for the Historical Society would be bequeathed to a distant, obscure charity in another state. Not only that, but a sealed letter from Aunt Beatrice, addressed specifically to Eleanor, was to be read immediately after. The codicil. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. Reconciliation with Clara, it was an impossibility. 30 years of silence, a chasm of unspoken resentments, an exile born of a secret Eleanor had buried so deep she believed it ceased to exist. Her mind reeled. The legacy she had dedicated her life to preserving, the very identity of her family, was now dangling by a thread, contingent on an act she felt utterly incapable of performing. The lawyer then, with a solemn expression, handed Eleanor the sealed envelope. Her fingers trembled as she tore it open. Aunt Beatrice's elegant looping script filled the page, but the words were anything but elegant. They were blunt, accusing, and steeped in a sorrowful truth. The letter spoke of Aunt Beatrice's profound regret, her understanding of the great injustice done to Clara, and her desperate hope that Eleanor would finally unburden herself of the lie that had driven Clara away. It laid bare, not explicitly, but with undeniable, Force, the deep ancient family secret related to Clara's sudden departure, a secret Eleanor had not only buried, but actively helped to distort and perpetuate. In that moment, Eleanor's carefully built world shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. The grand edifice of her life, once a bastion of tradition and respect, was now exposed, its foundations cracking under the weight of a truth she had tried to suppress. A wave of profound shock washed over her, followed by a dizzying sense of panic. Her breath caught in her throat, a tight knot of fear of exposure gripping her. How could Aunt Beatrice have done this? How could she have brought this buried shame to light? A suffocating wave of overwhelming guilt crashed down on her, a chilling realization that the carefully crafted narrative of her life was about to be unravelable for the entire town to see. She felt a surge of denial, a frantic urge to dismiss it all as a cruel joke, a misunderstanding. But the lawyer's serious expression, the uncomfortable silence of the room were undeniable. And then a hot, bitter anger began to simmer beneath the surface, anger at Aunt Beatrice for this cruel, posthumous demand, and a resurgence of the shame she thought she had long conquered, a shame that now threatened to consume her. The next few days were a blur of numb despair. The once comforting walls of her ancestral home felt like a prison. Every shadow seemed to hold a whispered accusation. Every silence echoed with the lawyer's pronouncement. The serene atmosphere of Oakhaven, once a source of comfort, now felt oppressive, as if every eye was upon her, waiting for her carefully constructed façade to crack. The town gossiped, of course, their quiet reverence quickly replaced by a morbid curiosity. The Vance secret was no longer a whispered rumor among a select few. It was a public spectacle. Eleanor found herself recoiling from daily life. She stopped her morning walks to the society, leaving its doors locked, its silence mirroring the void within her. The meticulous order of her home began to fray. Papers lay strewn on tables, dust motes danced in the uncleaned sunlight, and meals became an afterthought. Her initial attempts to reach Clara were desperate, disjointed messages left on an old, disconnected number, then an email to an address she wasn't even sure was still active. Each unanswered call, each ignored message, deepened her despair. She sat alone in the vast, quiet rooms, surrounded by the very legacy she was failing to protect. The portraits of her ancestors, once a source of pride, now seemed to stare down at her with judgment. The weight of their expectations, combined with the crushing burden of her own secret, was suffocating. She felt a profound sense of loss, not just of the estate, but of her carefully constructed identity, of the respect she had taken for granted, and of the peace she had falsely believed was hers. The world, once ordered and predictable, had become a chaotic, terrifying unknown. And the thought of facing Clara, of peeling back the layers of 30 years of lies, filled her with a paralyzing dread. The fall had been swift. The void that followed was vast and terrifying. The elegant ancestral home of Eleanor Vance, once a sanctuary of quiet dignity, had become a mausoleum of her despair. The pristine surfaces gathered a fine layer of dust, reflecting the internal chaos that mirrored the external neglect. Days bled into weeks, marked only by the deepening silence that filled the grand rooms. Eleanor, usually so fastidious, now moved through her life in a haze of apathy. Her once impeccable attire was replaced by rumpled clothes, her hair often loose from her customary bun, straggling around her face. Her meals were sporadic, often just a forgotten piece of toast or a half-eaten bowl of cereal left to harden on the counter. The vibrant life force that once animated her seemed to have drained away, leaving behind a hollowed-out shell. The Vance Historical Society, once her life's purpose, stood locked and eerily silent, its dark windows reflecting the empty street. The notice of its impending closure, due to the unmet conditions of the will, had been discreetly posted, yet it felt like a public accusation. Eleanor avoided looking at it, much as she avoided looking in the mirror. Every passing day was a fresh blow, a reminder of the legacy slipping through her fingers. The town, once so reverent, now buzzing with whispers and speculation. She could feel their eyes on her when she ventured out for groceries, their hushed tones like a physical weight on her shoulders. The shame was a constant burning ember in her gut. Her attempts to contact. Clara had predictably failed. Emails bounced back, phone numbers were disconnected. It was as if Clara had vanished, leaving no trace, just as Eleanor had once wished her to. But now that absence was a torment. She had tried reaching out through mutual acquaintances, old school friends, but was met with sympathetic sighs and vague promises that never materialized into contact. Clara's silence was a formidable, impenetrable wall, a stark reflection of the decades of bitterness and betrayal that separated them. Eleanor knew with a chilling certainty that Clara's resentment ran deep, far deeper than any legal codicil could hope to bridge. Eleanor's days returned into a monotonous cycle of guilt and exhaustion. She would sit for hours in her study, surrounded by her ancestors' stern portraits, staring blankly at the stacks of unopened mail from the Society's board, letters detailing their increasing alarm and the dire financial straits the institution now faced. The weight of it all was crushing. She'd occasionally pick up a history book, her old comfort, but the words blurred, meaningless. Her mind was a constant replay of the lawyer's voice, Aunt Beatrice's condemning letter, and the echo of a younger Clara's tear-streaked face. The physical toll began to show. Her eyes, once intelligent and cautious, were now haunted by sleepless nights, rimmed with dark circles. Her posture, usually so upright, seemed to slump, revealing an internal torment that even her ingrained stoicism could no longer conceal. She looked emotionally fragile, a stark contrast to the composed, unwavering woman she had been. Her silence deepened, her words becoming clipped and rare, as if the effort of speaking was too great. One particularly low evening, Eleanor found herself staring at an old, tarnished silver locket on her dressing table, a gift from Clara when they were children, a memory, sharp and painful, pierced through her fog. Clara, bright-eyed and mischievous, laughing as they carved their initials into an old oak tree behind their house. The contrast with the current reality was agonizing. A wave of profound sadness and self-loathing washed over her. How had she allowed their bond, once so vibrant, to be utterly destroyed by her fear and pride? She clenched the locket in her fist, its cold metal a painful reminder of what she had lost. The temptation to simply give up gnawed at her. Let the society close, let the legacy crumble. What did it matter if she was left with nothing but the echoes of her mistakes? Her only consistent interaction was with Mr. Albright, a kind, elderly local historian who had served on the Vance Historical Society's board for decades. He would call occasionally, his voice soft and hesitant, checking in on her. He never pushed, never explicitly mentioned the codicil, but his subtle encouragements were a quiet lifeline. "Eleanor," he'd say gently, "history is full of second chances. Not just for nations, but for people too. Sometimes the bravest thing we can do is to rewrite our own narratives." His words, though cryptic, were a faint glimmer of light in her darkness, a reminder that some people still believed in her, even if she didn't believe in herself. There were moments, fleeting glimpses, when a spark of her old determination would try to ignite. She'd considered drafting a letter to Clara, pouring out her heart, begging for forgiveness. But then the sheer enormity of the lie, the decades of its perpetuation, would overwhelm her, and the words would die in her throat. The shame and personal pride were formidable obstacles. Admitting her part in Clara's suffering, ignoring the calculated deception, felt like tearing open old wounds and exposing her deepest vulnerabilities. It was a humiliation she was not sure she could bear. The pressure on the society mounted relentlessly. Public donations, once a steady stream, had dried up. Board members, once deferential, now held emergency meetings, their panicked calls going unanswered by Eleanor. The building's upkeep, already substantial, became a source of constant worry. The old boiler broke down, and there was no money for repairs. The grand hall, once bustling, grew cold and damp. The threat of an imminent closure was no longer a distant possibility, it was a looming certainty. Each sign of the society's decline was another layer of concrete poured over Eleanor's despair, making it harder to breathe, harder to hope. One afternoon, a particularly painful moment pushed Eleanor to the very brink. She learned, through the hushed tones of a neighbor, that Clara was briefly in Oakhaven for an art exhibition in a small, independent gallery, a silent, defiant return to the very town that had once exiled her. Eleanor, fueled by a desperate, fleeting surge of hope, decided to go. She walked into the unassuming gallery, her heart pounding, and saw Clara from across the room. Clara was thinner, her face etched with lines of experience, but her eyes still held that fierce spark Eleanor remembered. But as Eleanor stepped forward, Clara saw her. For a moment, their eyes locked. Then a cold, hard mask descended over Clara's face. She approached Eleanor, her voice low, trembling with years of suppressed rage. "Do you have the audacity to show your face here?" Clara hissed, her words like daggers. "After everything you did, after you shattered my life to protect your precious family name, there's nothing left to reconcile, Eleanor, nothing but the ghost of a sister you destroyed." The words, though whispered, felt like a public condemnation echoing in the quiet gallery. The few patrons present turned to stare, their expressions a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Eleanor felt the familiar burning shame engulf her, hotter and more intense than ever before. Her carefully constructed façade finally cracked, tears blurring her vision. Clara turned abruptly and walked away, leaving Eleanor standing alone, shattered, amidst the vibrant, challenging art, a stark contrast to the desolate landscape of her soul. This confrontation, raw and unfiltered, pushed Eleanor to the edge. The despair was absolute. She returned home, sinking onto her worn sofa, convinced that Clara would never forgive her, that the legacy was lost, and that she was utterly, irredeemably alone. The thought of simply letting go, of surrendering to the void. The air in the Vance Historical Society building was thick with the dust of abandonment, a chilling silence amplified by the echoing emptiness of its grand halls. Sunlight, filtered through grimy, ancient windows, cast long, mournful shadows across the faded velvet ropes and silent display cases. It was here, in this hollowed-out shell of her life's work, that Eleanor finally found Clara. Mr. Albright, with a quiet determination, had somehow managed to arrange this meeting, a final, desperate plea to avoid the society's complete forfeiture. Clara stood by the large, empty plinth where a statue of their great-grandfather once stood proudly, her back to Eleanor, her posture stiff with decades of unresolved pain. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat of fear and desperate hope. She had rehearsed countless apologies, countless explanations, but each one felt hollow, inadequate. The air was heavy with unspoken accusations. Clara turned slowly, her eyes, usually so, vibrant even in their bitterness, were clouded with a deep weariness. "What more is there to say, Eleanor?" Clara's voice was flat, devoid of emotion, more devastating than any shout. "You chose a name, a building, over your own sister. You always did." The words hung in the oppressive silence, a searing indictment. Eleanor felt a familiar wave of shame, a defensive retort rising to her lips. But then she looked around the decaying hall, at the dust motes dancing in the faint light, at the empty spaces where generations of Vance history had been displayed. This was it. This was the end, not just of the society, but of any hope of redemption. The thought, stark and terrifying, pierced through her pride, reaching the raw nerve of her true sorrow. And in that moment, something within Eleanor snapped, not in anger, but in profound, agonizing vulnerability. The carefully constructed dam of her composure, built over 50 years, gave way. Her shoulders began to shake, and a choked sob escaped her lips. "You're right, Clara," she whispered, the words ragged, broken. "You are absolutely right." She didn't confess just the specific lie she'd told all those years ago about Clara's youthful indiscretion, twisting it to protect the family name. She didn't just confess to throwing Clara under the bus. She confessed the fear and insidious pride that had motivated her, the desperate need to maintain an unblemished facade, to uphold a legacy she now realized was built on a lie. Her voice, at first a choked whisper, grew stronger, imbued with a raw, desperate honesty. "I was so deceiving," Eleanor confessed, tears streaming down her face, unheeded, terrified of what people would say, of how it would look, of bringing shame to the Vance name. "I was a coward, Clara. I sacrificed you, my own sister, on the altar of my own fear and my own twisted pride." She didn't make excuses. She didn't defend herself. She simply stood there, exposed, completely undone. "I carried that. A burden, Clara," she continued, her voice thick with anguish. "That lie every single day. And it became heavier and heavier until it choked the life out of me. I see now the depth of your pain. I understand what I did. I ruined your reputation. I forced you to leave. And I didn't just regret it, I became defined by it. It was a suffocating secret, and it turned me into someone I barely recognize." Eleanor's rigid posture crumbled, replaced by a desperate, pleading vulnerability. She finally recognized the profound depth of Clara's suffering, taking total, agonizing responsibility. A tremor passed through Clara. Her hard gauze softened imperceptibly. A flicker of surprise, then perhaps a glimmer of understanding in her eyes. She had expected an argument, an excuse, a defense. She had not expected this raw, unfiltered confession, this complete dismantling of Eleanor's formidable pride. Then, with trembling hands, Eleanor reached into her worn leather handbag and pulled out a small, aged envelope. "There's something else," she said, her voice still hoarse with emotion. "Aunt Beatrice left this. It was meant for you. She wanted you to know." She held out the envelope to Clara. It was a letter, yellowed with time, from their aunt, long hidden, never sent. It detailed Aunt Beatrice's profound regret for the family secret, her own complicity in its concealment, and her fervent hope for reconciliation between the sisters. It was a symbol of Eleanor's complete surrender to honesty, her desperate desire for healing, not just for the society but for her soul. Clara took the letter, her fingers brushing Eleanor's. A wave of deep catharsis washed over Eleanor, a strange, liberating lightness replacing the crushing weight she had carried for decades. In that moment of utter vulnerability, Eleanor shed the last vestiges of her pride. She finally understood that true redemption wasn't about saving a legacy carved in stone. It was about healing a broken relationship, regardless of the outcome. She chose love, truth, and genuine connection over reputation and appearances. The silence in the Historical Society wasn't empty anymore. It was pregnant with the fragile, powerful possibility of forgiveness, a shared understanding beginning to bloom amidst the bad. The sunlight that now streamed through the meticulously cleaned windows of the Vance Historical Society felt different. It was no longer the mournful light of abandonment, but a warm, vibrant glow, illuminating the restored grandeur of the space. Eleanor Vance, though still possessing her quiet grace, moved with a newfound lightness in her step, a gentle warmth emanating from her that was profoundly different from her former reserved demeanor. The path to reconciliation with Clara was not a sudden, miraculous leap, but a fragile, arduous climb. There were more tense conversations, more moments of Clara's lingering bitterness, and more raw confessions from Eleanor. But this time, they were met with understanding, not denial. They started with small, tentative steps, shared cups of tea in the society's newly vibrant garden, quiet discussions about their shared childhood memories, carefully navigating the minefield of their past. Clara, still a force of nature, slowly allowed the impenetrable walls around her heart to soften, seeing the genuine transformation in her older sister. The conditions of Aunt Beatrice's will were met, not just formally, but in spirit. The Vance Historical Society was saved, its doors reopened to the community, but with a profoundly new atmosphere. Eleanor no longer viewed its preservation as a burden, a heavy duty to an unblemished past. Instead, it became a shared endeavor, a testament to the power of truth and healing. Clara, surprisingly, agreed to stay in Oakhaven for a time, not as an exile, but as a collaborator. They began to co-administer the society, incorporating not just the grand narratives of Oakhaven, but also the more personal, less glorified aspects of their own family's history, embracing authenticity over perfection. There was an exhibit curated by Clara featuring local artists, including some of her own early works, a subtle nod to the bohemian life she'd forged away from Oakhaven's rigid traditions. Eleanor, with her meticulous archival skills, helped unearth forgotten stories of resilience from the town's least prominent citizens, weaving them into the fabric of the society's narrative. Eleanor herself had undergone a profound metamorphosis. She was no longer merely an archivist of the past, but a guardian of the present truth and a hopeful architect of the future. Her once rigid posture had softened, her shoulders relaxed. Her eyes, still intelligent behind her spectacles, now held a deep, genuine warmth, a quiet strength that came not from concealment, but from having faced her deepest fears and exposed her rawest vulnerabilities. She was more empathetic, less guarded, and genuinely connected to her emotions, allowing herself to feel and express them without fear of judgment. Her strength now flows from her capacity for vulnerability and her courageous choice to seek healing. The community, initially filled with gossip and speculation, now looked upon the Vance sisters with a quiet respect. They witnessed the slow, arduous process of genuine reconciliation, a public act of humility and courage that resonated deeply. Eleanor found herself engaging with people in ways she never had before, listening intently, offering quiet wisdom, her experiences having forged a profound understanding of human frailty and resilience. Her relationship with Clara, although still complex and occasionally punctuated by the echoes of their past, was now built on an unshakable foundation of honesty and mutual respect. They were sisters, truly, for the first time in decades. One sunny afternoon, Eleanor and Clara stood side by side in the society's main hall, preparing for a small community gathering. Clara, with a rare, soft smile, nudged Eleanor. "You know," she said, "Aunt Beatrice was right. Sometimes the oldest secrets hold the most potential truths." Eleanor smiled back, a genuine, peaceful smile that reached her eyes. "And sometimes," she replied, "the greatest aren't found in what we preserve, but in what we dare to rebuild." Eleanor Vance had learned that the most valuable legacies weren't carved in stone or meticulously catalogued in history books. They are forged in the painful, yet ultimately liberating act of confronting the truth, seeking genuine forgiveness, and courageously rebuilding what was broken. True strength doesn't lie in the perfection of the past, but in the profound courage to heal the present. Her life, once a monument to a carefully constructed lie, had become a living testament to the transformative power of honesty and the enduring bond of family. She had not only saved the Vance legacy, she had redeemed it, giving it a truer, more human meaning.